Good morning. This morning I want to share with you some other Sienese artists. We looked at Duccio's Maestà last time and discussed Duccio and Sienese art in his reflection, as it were. But Siena is a very important city, and its art has a particular flavor, and the entire city does, and I want to spend a little more time with it. It has its own peculiarities. Every town and city does, of course, but in Italy, this, during the period we're studying now, takes on a particular meaning. There is a phrase, an Italian phrase, a simple one, ma paese, my country. Well, in Italy, ma paese does mean my country, as in nation, but first and foremost it means my town, my city. And this is a fact of language, of culture, and it's critical to understanding the development of Italy during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right up to the present day, I think. It indicates that a person is defined by the place where he or she was born. That close identification with place means that the larger entities, regional or national governments that may govern one by choice or by force, are not the determinants, not the controlling factors that they may fancy themselves to be. How else do you think Italy has gotten through 50 or 60 governments since the Second World War? Pardon the digression, but it seems to me that it helps to explain the phenomenon of the Italian city-state during the period we're studying right now. These city-states were really communes, which had developed as self-governing units during the long, chaotic period of the barbarian invasions and the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the social disruption of a huge political unit into dukedoms and other fiefdoms based on military power. The city-states that arose in the central portion of the Italian peninsula, Tuscany included, were usually republics, mercantile cities dominated by mercantile interests. They were often at war with neighbors, frequently the same neighbors, over and over. Nonetheless, they were proud republics, proud of their independence, and proud because they regarded themselves as civic polities, united for the good of all their citizens, well, at least most of their citizens. The definition of citizen in any republic is always a tricky matter. Siena was a bitter rival to Florence, 45 miles to the north. Like Florence, Siena had important banking operations throughout Europe. Despite the intense political hostility between the two cities, there was cultural exchange, and artists from one city not infrequently worked for patrons in the other. One of the most important Sienese painters, following in the footsteps of Duccio, was Simone Martini, born about 1284 and died in 1344. He was Duccio's pupil, we think, and he emulated both the elegant linearity and the coloristic brilliance of his teacher. He was also influenced by the sculpture of Giovanni Pisano and by French art. His fame was, as he matured and worked widely, his fame was not just spread throughout Italy or the Italian peninsula, but throughout Europe. We're looking now at his Annunciation, a large painting, 10 feet wide. It is in the Uffizi today. It was painted in 1333. It is signed, and it is a painting that simply knocks the eyes out. It was painted for a chapel in the Siena Cathedral. It was famous from the time it was painted, I think, and has been, as it were, a textbook example of great Sienese art ever since. The lateral saints, by the way, the standing saints on either side, were painted by Lippo Memmi, the brother-in-law of Simone, who was also his pupil. But the center panel is entirely Simone Martini. This is a very elaborate painting, elaborate architecture in its frame, very elaborate, with many cusps and twisted columns and a complex set of gables and pinnacles and extraordinarily intricate tooled designs in the gold leaf that dominates this ensemble. I cannot begin to imagine what this cost, just for the sheer amount of gold. It's the stunning gold and orange blaze of the main panel a background. The background is a wall of gold, the gold and orange of Gabriel's wings here on the left, and his wonderful, striking plaid cloak. Nobody's ever figured out quite where that came from. Not that there weren't lots of textile mills and so forth, but the plaid looks out of place, no matter how beautiful it is. The same orange colors in Mary's throne, this gold and orange behind her. The radiance of the dove with the Holy Spirit up here in a circle of angels' wings, sort of cherubim wings. The urn below holding the lilies is also gold. The veined marble pavement is full of gold and orange. That's the whole thrust of the color scheme. Our eyes are nearly blinded by this feast of gold and orange. Its suddenness. It's decorative, yes, but you know, its suddenness is also analogous to the effect that the Annunciation has upon Mary. It's always interesting in Annunciations to see the response of the Virgin. Here, as Gabriel alights, his cloak is still fluttering behind him. Just come in a hurry, and he thrusts his head forward into the center area, beneath that central arch of the paintings, and his words, which are embossed on the gold ground, running from here his head to hers, Ave gratia plena Dominus tecum, hail thou that art full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And he's, as it were, he pushes forward and those words are pushed right to her. Well, the force of this arrival and this news, unexpected, seems to almost physically push Mary away. She shrinks back from it. Indeed, I think if you look at her face, she looks not only startled, but a little unhappy. The artist has drawn her robe in a long, falling curve that breaks sharply at the knee, and she withdraws into the area beneath the small arch on the right. She just sort of shrinks back into it. This is something you'll see a century later in Botticelli, but it is always interesting to see how an artist interprets her response, the Virgin's response to this startling news. Because of all this gold, and because of the emphasis on outline, on contour, this is almost a cutout feeling of the Virgin's costume. Because of this, this masterpiece of a painting is nearly two-dimensional in its effect. You don't have that feeling that we've become used to in Giotto and to a degree in smaller panels in Duccio of round three-dimensional bodies. They are modeled, and yet they're hit so hard, backed up so hard, as it were, by the gold and also the emphasis on contour, that they tend toward the two-dimensional. The sweep and the visual bounce of the gold and the emphasis on the contour and the line simply assure this. And it's especially apparent when you compare it with a painting only 9 years later by an artist named Ambrogio Lorenzetti, his presentation in the temple, which you see now. Painted in 1342, in the Uffizi, as by the way, the preceding painting by Simoniez, it upsets some Sienese that two of their greatest paintings are in Florence in the museum there. Nonetheless, they're there to be found. Here, in Ambrogio's painting, the pictorial space is developed carefully and convincingly. We feel it as well as see it. It's not constructed from any perspective science. It's intuitive space, but it's remarkable nonetheless. The figures are, as we've seen in other examples, proportionately larger than the architecture. They should be smaller or it should be larger, as in Giotto and Duccio, but less so than in Giotto. And the architecture attracts our eyes to explore it. We find ourselves looking past the figures and into the architecture. Indeed, this is one of the first, if not the first, fully developed renderings of architectural space in late medieval painting. We've not yet seen a painting of this subject, though we will see later examples. The subject is Joseph and Mary bringing Jesus to the temple to be, quote, consecrated to the Lord. They have handed him to Simeon, who had been told, who had been promised that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. The prophetess Anna stands behind him, or to our right, holding a long scroll with a part of the passage from the Gospel of Luke, which describes this particular event. Ambrogio has differentiated and characterized the holy figures with touching attention to detail, and he's painted their costumes with a range and richness of color fully worthy of Sienese art. I just let your eye glide over the range of colors here in the group on the left alone, and for that matter in the architecture, the pinks, the blues, an extraordinary range of colors. This architectural element at the top suggests a baptistry, though it is above a church-like area below. In a few moments, we'll see both of these artists, again, in earlier works that they painted in the major civic building of Siena, the Palazzo Pubblico, or Town Hall. But first, a word about and a look at Pietro Lorenzetti. Pietro Lorenzetti, born about 1290, who was the brother of Ambrogio Lorenzetti and who with him dominated Sienese painting after Simone Martini left the city to paint elsewhere. I should say what elsewhere is in this case. Simone Martini's fame was very, very wide, and he had been called first to Naples to paint for the Duke there, painting major work, and then came back home to Siena, and then he was called, I'm sure didn't just sort of wander off in the hopes of a job, I'm sure he was invited to Avignon. During 3/4 of the 14th century, the papacy was not in Rome, but in Avignon, and it's complicated enough that I'm going to leave that part of church history alone for the moment. But it meant that all of the papal patronage was moved there, which meant it was being moved into what we call France, and therefore affecting Northern European artists very strongly. They saw the art that was being created there by Italian artists, and Simone did many important things there that must have had a great impact upon Northerners coming down to Avignon. Of course, great architecture was built there to build the papal palace as well. In any event, that meant that Simone, who had been the city painter, effectively, was now gone. And Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, we don't know which was the elder, were left to dominate Sienese painting after that and became, in a sense, official painters. But I want to show you a work by Pietro Lorenzetti in another place, in Assisi, which I have mentioned before because of the shrine of Saint Francis there. In the 1320s, Pietro Lorenzetti was summoned to paint a major fresco cycle at this splendid basilica, the famous Basilica of San Francesco, St. Francis, at Assisi, which had become quickly one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Italy after St. Francis was buried there, I think in 1230, and it's the town of his birth. And he was buried in this ever-growing church complex. Many of Italy's finest artists worked there, including Giotto, some 30 years before Pietro Lorenzetti. There are two churches in one at Assisi, the upper church where Giotto had worked and the lower church. Pietro was given the task of decorating or supervising the decoration of, again, think always of teams of artists working under the master, the vaults and walls of the left transept of the lower church. I hesitate to leave this great view of the basilica, which is in Umbria and in these marvelous hills and sky. But here we are in the lower transept, the transept of the lower church. It's known as the Lorenzetti Chapel because Pietro was in charge of all of it. Some parts have been lost, as you can see toward the left. But in the 1320s and 30s, he oversaw this fresco decoration. The subject of the whole cycle here, I'm looking at it and imagining how hard it must have been to paint that vault. The subject is the Passion of Christ, beginning with the entry into Jerusalem. And the entry into Jerusalem is the painting which I will share with you. It's at the end of the view of this transept and on the ceiling. And here it is. And it's a magnificent example of his art. Pietro Lorenzetti learned much from Giotto's example. But he remains an artist for whom detail, both decorative and narrative, was irresistible. I did not show you Giotto's version of this, but let me show you this in some detail just to guide you through it. It has great charm. Christ is entering into Jerusalem. This is what we know as Palm Sunday, and there are the palms thrown on the ground, and here a drapery has been laid out in front for the as though nobility were coming, for Christ and the horse the donkey, to pass over it. The gate is behind, but stuffed with people, crammed with people who have poured out of the city gate in order to greet this arrival. St. Peter is here, just behind Jesus. A wonderful blue robe, which seems to have retained all of its intensity here, the robe of Jesus, and a whole group of apostles, we assume, following here into the city. There's a detail here which is quite common and is based in Scripture, or at least in descriptions. I shouldn't say in Scripture without double-checking, but you see there are two children who have climbed trees here in order to get a better view of the occasion. This may have come from the Golden Legend, I should have checked, but in any event, it is commonly included and is always a charming detail. Within the city gates, he has had a lot of fun describing city architecture, very Toei architecture, and a little bit like Duccio's Cities of the World being shown by the devil to tempt Christ, but a little bit of everything. This, I assume, is a baptistry or baptistry-like church, a tower over here, a wonderful loggia here, double loggia space with staircase and window, beautiful tracery in the window, wonderful decoration on the building, and then the open square covering for the gate to the city. And by the way, on the side of the gate, what appears to be mosaic, you see it's a gold ground, so this was probably a mosaic here, and I'm pretty sure that it's the temptation. I think it is Eve handing the fruit to Adam, and that of course is appropriate because Christ's entry here marks the beginning of his passion, and therefore the salvation from the fall that began with the passing of the fruit. So putting it up there makes perfect sense. I'm going to turn now from Pietro Lorenzetti back to Siena, back from Assisi to Siena, and to the Palazzo Pubblico. This building, one of the most elegant monuments of the Italian Gothic in architecture, and one of the most imposing, was begun at the end of the 13th century, 1297, and largely finished by 1342. The tower is later, at least in its completion. That's a mammoth tower, as you see, and part of its reason being placed there was to support some walls which hadn't been too well built, apparently. But obviously the interior of this building gave a lot of space for wonderful decoration. The campo itself, and that means field, but it's a piazza or field, and the full title is in fact Piazza del Campo in Siena. It's always been the center of civic life in Siena. Siena is a hilly town, as you can see instantly from this curve. The Campo slopes in the shape of half a conch shell and comes in together and focuses upon the city hall. Now, in the Palazzo Pubblico, I want to show you the council hall, the Sala del Consiglio. This is a long view. At the window wall on the front is from the piazza side. On the end wall hangs Simone Martini's Maestà. You see, I told you would encounter the word again. His Majesty, the same subject as Duccio, but treated much differently, as we'll see in a moment. It's on the end wall. Here is the Maestà in fresco. Much of the fresco was secco, dry, and therefore it has suffered in a lot of places and had a lot of repaint in addition. But it is treated very differently than Duccio's work. Instead of being an altarpiece, it's a wall decoration, and it's been painted to look as though it were a tapestry. It's given a tapestry border. The whole illusion here is to suggest, I think, that it is a tapestry. The enthroned Virgin and Child and their court of saints on both sides are covered by this wonderful canopy. Canopy supported by slender poles, perhaps a reflection of an actual structure used to protect secular rulers out of doors, But also, this sort of structure or canopy was used to protect the Eucharist when it was carried in procession, as it sometimes was on holy days. The sag of the canopy itself, you see what I mean, the painted canopy within, that sag, it seems to me, to enhance the whole illusion that the entire painting is a tapestry, because tapestries tend to sag on the wall. It's inframed by the simulated architecture and the simulated tapestry border, in which there are rondels with heads of the fathers of the church and the prophets. Simone Martini also painted this in the same hall on the opposite end, this magnificent Guido Riccio da Folignano. It's an equestrian portrait of a Sienese captain, which was painted to celebrate a major victory he won that year. And it faces the Maestà from the other end of the room and covers the whole upper part of that wall. No landscape of such ambition had yet been painted in Italy, or for that matter anywhere. The full size of it is amazing. Nothing since ancient Roman times, and it's compelling today still. It shows the fortified town that was captured over here to the left, miniature. It shows a fortress here and a battle encampment over here, and a very large figure of Guido Riccio moving along. This is 40 feet wide, by the way, just to give you a sense, and so these toy towns are still pretty large in their effect. In the Sala della Pace, which adjoins this room, there is one of the most amazing groups of works of frescoes in Siena or anywhere. These are allegories of good and bad government. The photo that you're seeing here shows only two walls. It shows the allegory of good government on one wall. The allegory of bad government is on the left wall. It's badly damaged, and when it was painted in an area that fell into shadow, I guess that's what you do to bad government. The right-hand wall has a huge landscape. The hall is directly behind the large council chamber and was this room, where the 9 lords or governors of Siena met. Simone Martini moved to Avignon and so left behind just such work as this, and Ambrogio Lorenzetti succeeded him, and this important commission was fulfilled by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. Here I'm going to show you first the end wall with the allegory of good government, and then the side wall. The allegory of good government, it represents symbolically the commune of Siena. It is the personified image of the commune. The single personification is right here. A huge old man, do you see him seated here? Gigantic figure, holding a scepter and an orb, dressed in the colors of the Republic, and flanked by the cardinal and theological virtues, while faith, hope, and charity hover above his head. Farther to the left, another huge figure, female, is justice personified, with wisdom floating above her head. She is dispensing rewards and punishments. The citizens who made up the Great Council are painted here in portraits, arrayed across the front of this on a lower stage. Oh, and Peace, I almost forgot about the allegorical figure for whom this hall, Sala della Pace, is generally named. Peace is here. She apparently finds herself with nothing to do, so effective is the government, and so she sits here lolling idly in a white dress in the center, between the personifications of Siena on the one hand and justice on the other. She looks strangely modern to me in her pose. Learn, or contemporary would be the word. We're surprised to learn, however, that Ambrogio borrowed her pose directly from an ancient Roman sarcophagus that's still in the Palazzo Pubblico, the same building, today. Now, the fresco showing the effects of good government in the city and good government in the country is a continuous wall-length painting in all about 46 feet long. Surely the most important monumental civic image in Italy during the 14th century, and it rivals those found in Venice in the 16th century, and indeed none of those in Venice encompassed such a panoramic, encyclopedic, and realistic view of the city and the countryside. These may be allegories of government, but unlike the allegory of the commune that we just looked at, these ignore mostly the symbolic images and concentrate on a recognizable world of 14th century Siena. We'll look at this in two parts. It's the only way one can. First city, then country, and we'll start at the point that divides them, the city wall and gate. Let your eye wander from the city gate at the upper right here. We have figures entering here, and I'm just going to do this sweep down through it. The whole scene is commanded by architecture which is a mix of Romanesque and Gothic. It commands the scene, wonderful architecture, and it speaks of civic pride, surely. In the extreme upper left, by the way, you can see the bell tower of the cathedral, the black and white bell tower closing the scene. Gray is the dominant color of the foreground buildings, while behind them there is deep red over here and light pink, particularly here, which seems to introduce sunlight into the middle ground. It's quite marvelous. And by the way, this is a city still in the making, because we see a building under construction right here with scaffolding and 5 or 6 workmen carrying materials and laying a new course of stone or brick. The citizens of the town and the farmers from the countryside mingle on the streets. They form a kind of meandering line from the gate up here, right down through across the front until it finally exits on the lower left-hand side, which, by the way, leads you, if you're a visitor to the room, right to the wall of the allegory of good government, of the commune sitting there. So back to the right, to the city gate. Here is a detail, and you can see donkeys which have entered here, and some of them are being unloaded, but there are a couple of heavily laden donkeys. People that seem to be setting up shop almost, as it were, here. They're accompanied by farmers. Here is a woman carrying a basket on her head, a large basket, and behind her a woman who seems to have a fowl, a duck, or something in her arms. Lots of bustle in the background here, perhaps of goods being exchanged or street shops set up. The central architectural group is defined by a triple loggia, 3 arches. In the first, on the right, we see a wine merchant, I think, setting out flasks of wine on the edge of the street. In the middle is clearly a schoolroom. There's the schoolmaster with his cap and his attentive, we hope, pupils. And then on the left-hand side, we see a very prosperous, it looks like a very prosperous shoemaker's shop with 3 artisans at work inside and 1 customer here approaching the shop. The next group is the only one that seems a little unrealistic. It's a group of 10 women, but one of them has lost a good deal of her substance, scraped off. 10 women who dance demurely in a sort of serpentine circle while another woman keeps time with the tambourine, which she holds here. Surely they must be intended to symbolize the civility and culture and pleasure of the city. I can't imagine that they danced in the streets that often in Siena. In the next detail, as one just moves along to the left, is a large building, large arched opening in it. Several men there are conversing, standing and conversing, and these perhaps gambling, but there is damage here. The upper story of the building has wonderful, elegant windows with single mullions in them. And then this small procession of persons who are on horseback and on foot, which we saw at the beginning of the tour, are here headed toward another gate to leave that scene. Then the country, and we go back to the gate. We started at the city gate, and the people passing out, passing each other, coming in and going out. Now we shall go out into the country from this area. I show you this close up with donkeys coming in as an elegant pair of nobles on horseback with a hawk are going out on a hawking party or expedition in the countryside. In the foreground are men tending what look like very healthy vines, a vineyard. And here on the road, farmers are leading, one of them leading a large hog, and heavily laden donkeys going up this very steep slope, which are in sharp contrast to another group down here, which we'll see in a moment, of huntsmen. But one really begins to feel the effort of going up this hill and going in the city gate to sell one's goods. At the detail at the bottom of the hill in this field, this is not a field that has been planted, but the dogs and horsemen are hunting in this field. You can see details of them. And in the lower right-hand corner, there are more donkeys with produce from the country crossing a red stone bridge on their way to the hill and the city. The whole image across the panoramic background are Tuscan hills of many sizes and shapes. Some are planted in vineyards or otherwise tilled. Others perhaps orchards, farms, and castles or villages. And in the distance over here, for instance, in the back, you can see heavily forested green areas and then sharper mountain ridges beyond. Not much in the way of sky or clouds, but as far as the panorama is concerned, extraordinary. Oh, and I haven't forgotten the charming lady up here. Charming, lightly seductive lady who floats in the air by the city gate. Her hands are full. She's the personification of security, and in her right hand a scroll announces the tranquility and peace that the commune of Siena provides its citizens, while in her left hand is a miniature gallows with the corpse of someone who threatened that peace and paid the price. Back to the whole room to give you a feeling of this enormous two frescoes, but especially of the allegory of good and bad government in the city. It's a glorious decorative scheme for the proud city commune, a self-satisfied government and populace. But this was just before that awful event, the crisis which in time overwhelmed most of Europe, the plague of 1348, the Black Death, which in Siena left city development frozen in its age of glory. Its artists were among the victims. Both Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti are presumed to have died in the plague. It would be 300 years before the Palazzo Pubblico was modified or added to in any significant way. But in this vast mural, we are left with an unforgettable record of the prosperous calm before the calamitous storm. Thank you.